Welcome to this week's segment of Around the World. My name is Pooja. In the recent times, the world has been continuously facing several crises like climate change, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the challenges of adopting economic reforms after the COVID pandemic, China's expansionist policy in South and Southeast, etc. Against this backdrop, the meeting of G7 leaders held in Bavaria, Germany, in the presence of several other G20 countries along with India, is being considered cardinal, as even under these circumstances, the members of the G7 organization of the developed, industrialized economies managed to present a common front. It issued a standalone G7 statement in support of Ukraine, committing to provide unconditional financial, humanitarian, military, and diplomatic assistance to Ukraine. G7 also reiterated that it will stand by Ukraine as long as it is needed. It can be considered a very commendable step. However, the G7 statement would have been considered more substantial if concerted efforts were made in this direction instead of just running a talk shop. It was being speculated that an anti-Russian formulation would be announced during the summit as no concerted efforts were made for countering Russia. On the contrary, the issue of China's Belt and Road Initiative was emphasized during the meeting. G7 announced a $600 billion plan to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative in developing countries. Two pertinent questions arise at this juncture. Firstly, whether this $600 billion plan be able to beat the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, and how much is India going to benefit from this plan? Secondly, will this standalone G7 statement issued in support of Ukraine pose a challenge to Russia? We will try to find answers to both these questions in today's story, but let us first of all discuss about G7. France and Germany, together with Great Britain, Italy, Japan and the United States, had convened a meeting in France to deal with the global economic crises that arose in the 1970s. At that time, this meeting was named World Economic Summit. This summit mainly focused on the economic problems of the 1970s, such as the oil crisis and the collapse of the system of fixed exchange rates set by the Bretton Woods Summit. At present, the G7 has become an informal organization of major industrialized countries like Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan and United Kingdom and United States. Canada was not involved in the G7 established in 1975 under the name of World Economic Summit. Canada joined this group at the first formal summit held in Puerto Rico in 1976, and thus the initial G7 was formed in Puerto Rico. When foreign policy and security issues were included in the G7 in the 1980s, then the Secretary General of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, was invited to the 1991 London summit for talks. Thereafter, Russia became a permanent member of the G7 in 1998, and the group came to be known as the G8. However, the new name G8 did not last for long. Russia was expelled from this group after it annexed Crimea in 2014. Thus, the organization again came to be known as the G7. However, today's G7 is different from the G7 of the 1970s. At present, the G7 has expanded itself. As per the summit's website, the G7 countries account for only 10% of the world's population in 2022. However, they control about 31% of the global GDP. They contribute about 21% of the global carbon dioxide emissions. G7 countries are considered to be the major players in global trade, particularly the US and Germany are among the major exporting countries of the world. Both the countries have sold goods worth over $1 trillion to foreign countries in 2021. China and India, the two most populous countries with the world's largest GDP, are not a part of the G7. Delegates from the European Union always participate in the annual meetings of the G7 heads of state and governments. The European Union has become a permanent partner of the G7 since the 1981 Ottawa Summit. The next summit of the G7, which is to be held in 2023, will be presided over by Japan. However, Germany is presiding over the G7 summit for the 7th time in 2022. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz invited India, including Argentina, Indonesia, Senegal, South Africa as partner countries to the recently held G7 summit. President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, also joined the summit through video conferencing. However, Russia and China, considered opponents and competitors of the G7 countries, were not present at the summit. On behalf of India, the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, participated in the summit. According to the Ministry of External Affairs, Indian Prime Minister addressed 2 sessions at this summit. India was invited to the G7 summit to support the G7 countries for completely isolating Russia. They requested India to cooperate in restricting the purchase of Russian oil and stop carrying out trade with Russia by using rupee-ruble mechanism, as it bypasses the sanctions imposed by the US on Russia. They also requested Indian PM to lift the ban on wheat exports. However, the Prime Minister of India turned down all these requests for the time being. Then, a pertinent question arises that did the G7 countries commit a mistake in inviting India to the summit? India was not invited to the G7 summit for completely isolating Russia. Even the G7 knows that its dominance has become less than it was 20 years ago, and it intends to increase its dominance again. Therefore, the G7 seeks to regain its old dominance by making other fast-growing countries as a part of its organization. As part of this plan, the G7 invites major G20 countries as observers to the summit. As far as India is concerned, its importance lies in the indisputable truth that no global problem can be seriously solved without India's participation, as its position in the global system has now become very pivotal. In such a scenario, the question arises that whether India will be able to take advantage of its position. Now, another pertinent question arises that whether the standalone G7 statement issued in support of Ukraine poses a challenge to Russia. Through the standalone G7 statement, Russia was warned that if it uses chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, then it will have to face dire consequences. It also mentions that harsher sanctions would be imposed on Russia. These sanctions include raising tariffs on Russian products, targeting gold exports, capping oil prices, and restricting access to technology. Various experts are of the view that the statement holds Russia guilty of war crimes. But whether this statement intends to support Ukraine, the straightforward answer to this question is no. When Russia was about to invade Ukraine, then the so-called global powers did nothing to avert this war. Instead, they were busy running talk shops and issuing hollow warnings to Russia through global organizations like the G7. Russia's relentless attack on Kiev was enough to expose the powerlessness of these global powers. On one hand, the summit was being held in Germany, and on the other hand, Russia was launching missile attacks on Ukraine's capital, Kiev. In such a scenario, the G7 leaders could only condemn Russia's aggression. Moreover, the issue of providing weapons to Ukraine was also postponed for the NATO summit to be held in Madrid. It clearly reflects the real intentions of the global powers of the world. It is a well-known fact that the sale of arms is the main source of income for Western countries, and weapons will be sold only when there is a conflict between two countries or there is an atmosphere of war between them. By providing arms to Ukraine in the Russia-Ukraine war, the Western countries are adding fuel to the fire. They are also promoting the arms race by providing Ukraine with advanced weapons on a large scale. These Western countries will also benefit from the increase in arms race. Western countries only intend to earn benefits by trading arms through ethical or unethical means. Hence, the G7 prioritized China's Belt and Road Initiative over anti-Russian formulation. Now, let us discuss that whether this $600 billion plan be able to beat the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. It was speculated that the issue of anti-Russian formulation would be prioritized over China's BRI. On the contrary, the G7 prioritized China's BRI over anti-Russian formulation. A total of 6 paragraphs were devoted to the document showcasing the G7's demand on China. The document emphasized on the need for peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. Then, peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues was emphasized. Then, China was advised to adopt the United Nations Charter on the peaceful settlement of disputes. In addition, the document also mentioned the human rights situation in Hong Kong, Tibet, and Xinjiang. Moreover, this document also mentioned that China's huge maritime claims in the South China Sea have no legal basis. Apart from the above-mentioned issues, the recently held G7 summit mainly focused on developing transparent and game-changing infrastructure projects in developing countries like India to counter China's BRI, and raising funds of $600 billion by 2027 for this purpose. The G7 move will certainly limit the scope of China's BRI, but it remains to be seen that how much dent the G7 $600 billion plan will put on China's BRI. Let us look at the question for today. India was invited to the G7 summit for isolating Russia. Critically examine the statement.